The house waited at the end of the dirt road like something abandoned by time itself, its windows dark and watching. I had come because of blood, because this was the place my mother never spoke of, the place that carried the silence she wore like a second skin. But the moment I stepped through the rust-bitten gate, the air felt weighted, as if it carried secrets that had never been allowed to breathe. The family greeted me without a single word, their eyes calm, their faces unreadable, and instead of voices they made soft, pulsing sounds, barely audible, yet strangely rhythmic, like breaths layered over distant echoes. At first, I thought it was some unspoken agreement among them, a way of living that simply avoided speech. But the longer I stayed, the more the sounds felt wrong, too patterned, too rehearsed, too synchronized. At night, those sounds drifted through the wooden floors and seeped into my dreams, coaxing me awake with vibrations that seemed to rattle inside my skull. Whenever I tried to speak to them, they only watched me with a mix of pity and warning, their throats humming gently, responding in tones that felt older than language itself. By the third day, the silence of the place no longer felt like quiet at all. It felt alive, as though something unseen breathed between the walls, using the family as its instrument. Their movements were smooth, their rituals wordless but precise, and every sound they made followed a rhythm I couldn't understand yet couldn't forget. Sometimes, when the house settled at night, I could swear I heard another layer beneath their tones, something deeper, something that wasn't coming from any human throat. And in those moments, I began to wonder if the silence the family carried for generations wasn't a choice, but a curse that had finally begun to notice me. The discovery of the old journal begins with an almost accidental moment, yet it becomes the quiet, pulsing heartbeat of everything that follows, a thin thread pulling the protagonist deeper into the family's hidden past. It is found tucked beneath loose floorboards in the smallest bedroom, the one no one in the family ever sleeps in, the one that smells faintly of dust and something older, as if time clings more heavily there. The journal itself is fragile, its leather cracked and its pages yellowed to the color of old bone, but the handwriting inside is what captures attention first. Sharp strokes, ink pressed hard enough that the letters seem carved rather than written. At a glance, it appears to be the ramblings of a restless mind, but the more the protagonist reads, the clearer it becomes that this was written by someone who feared what words could invite. The earliest entries describe a family who once spoke normally, who laughed, argued, whispered to each other in the quiet moments of dusk. Then the tone shifts. The writer mentions a voice that did not belong to any of them, something they heard in the late hours when the house settled and the world outside went still. At first it was faint, a hum barely perceptible, like the wind vibrating through the walls. But the hum grew louder with each passing night, mimicking human patterns, trying to form sounds that resembled speech. The family tried to ignore it until the day one of the children began repeating the hum unconsciously, as though the melody of that unseen thing had woven itself into his thoughts. Entry after entry shows the family's growing fear, each page more frantic than the last, detailing how their spoken language began to erode. Words felt unsafe, as if speaking aloud might draw the attention of whatever waited in the shadowed corners of the house. They turned instead to soft sounds, rhythmic hums and gentle pulses, believing that if they abandoned human speech, the entity would lose interest. The journal reveals how this practice solidified into a rule, then into tradition, passed down from generation to generation until no one remembered why speaking aloud was forbidden, only that silence was survival. As the protagonist reads, a chill settles into their bones, not because of what the journal says outright, but because of what it implies. This family didn't simply choose silence, they fled into it. Their language, strange and inhuman as it now seems, was a shield crafted in desperation, a barrier against a presence that wanted to be heard. And with each line that unfolds, the protagonist realizes the danger did not fade with time. It is still here, still listening, waiting for a voice bold or careless enough to answer it. The protagonist's arrival at the family's secluded home marks the first moment when the atmosphere of strangeness shifts from distant suspicion to unsettling reality. The journey itself feels like crossing an invisible threshold. The road narrows, the air thickens, and the natural sounds of the world seem to fall away one by one until even the hum of insects becomes strangely absent. By the time the protagonist steps out of the car, an eerie stillness hangs over the property, stretching across the sagging porch, the buckled shutters, and the tall grass that sways without the help of any wind. The house seems to breathe in its own rhythm, A slow inhale trapped behind old wood and worn paint. There is a moment of hesitation before the door opens, not from knocking but as though the house anticipated the arrival and chose to greet its newest visitor. The family stands in the doorway with expressions that are calm but unreadable, their eyes studying the protagonist with a focus that feels almost too intent. What's immediately unsettling is the lack of verbal greeting, no warm welcome, no awkward introductions, not even a whisper. Instead, they emit soft, melodic sounds that seem to harmonize with one another. The tones rise and fall in patterns the protagonist cannot make sense of, like a conversation in a language built entirely from breath and vibration rather than words. At first, it almost seems beautiful, but the longer the protagonist listens, the more the unfamiliarity becomes suffocating. These sounds aren't mere gestures of hospitality, they feel practiced, deliberate, and impossibly synchronized, as if the family has rehearsed them for years. As the protagonist is ushered inside, the strangeness only deepens. They notice how the family moves in a fluid, almost choreographed manner. Even the youngest members communicate through murmurs and gentle pulses of sound, never once forming a single spoken word. Every attempt by the protagonist to speak aloud causes the family to pause, their eyes flicking toward one another with a mixture of caution and subtle disapproval, as though words are a volatile substance that might spill and attract something none of them are willing to name. The protagonist senses that silence in this house isn't just a habit, it is a rule woven into the very bones of their lives. What unsettles the protagonist most is the feeling that the family is listening for something beyond normal conversation. Their eyes often drift toward the walls or the ceiling, reacting to faint noises the protagonist can't hear. There is an unspoken tension in their movements, a collective vigilance that suggests they aren't simply avoiding speech, they are hiding from something that might awaken if a single true word slips into the air. In those first moments among them, the protagonist realizes they have stepped into a world where silence isn't peaceful but protective, and whatever it guards against is far from finished. The first time the protagonist witnesses the family's nocturnal ritual, it unfolds with such unsettling precision that it becomes impossible to dismiss their behavior as mere eccentricity. It begins late at night, long after the house has settled into its usual oppressive quiet. The protagonist, restless and unable to sleep, notices faint vibrations threading up through the floorboards, so soft at first they could be mistaken for the distant rumble of a passing truck. But the house is too isolated for that, and the sound carries an odd rhythm, like a heartbeat that doesn't belong to any single person. Drawn by equal parts curiosity and unease, the protagonist follows the vibrations down the stairs, careful not to disturb the creaking wood more than necessary. What they find is the entire family gathered in a perfect circle at the center of the living room, seated on the floor with their backs straight and their eyes half closed, as if in a state between waking and dreaming. Their mouths are slightly open, and from each throat comes a distinct yet interconnected sound. The tones weave together into a strange, pulsating harmony, low hums, sharp clicks, brief inhalations layered over one another with unsettling accuracy. It isn't random noise. It is structured, rhythmic, almost ritualistic, and the way the sounds bounce off the walls creates the illusion of more voices than there are people in the room. What unsettles the protagonist further is the intensity with which the vibrations fill the space. The air itself seems to thrum, pressing gently but insistently against their skin. Each sound reverberates in a way that feels internal, as though it's being absorbed directly into the bones rather than heard with the ears. The family members sway in unison, their bodies responding to some pattern only they understand. Their eyes never fully open, yet they are aware of one another, reacting subtly to changes in tone with a cohesiveness that borders on unnatural. The protagonist watches from the shadows, torn between fascination and a creeping fear that something unseen sits at the center of this ritual, something the family is communicating with or appeasing. The harmony grows more complex, and for a moment the protagonist imagines they can hear an additional layer of sound, faint, distant, and not produced by any human mouth. It could be a trick of the mind, a distortion caused by standing too close to the vibrating air. But the expressions on the faces of the family members shift almost imperceptibly, tightening with a mix of concentration and dread, as if they, too, sense a presence drawing nearer. The ritual ends abruptly with a synchronized exhale, and the silence that follows feels heavier than the noise. The family rises without acknowledging the protagonist's hidden presence, dispersing wordlessly into their rooms as though nothing unusual has occurred, leaving the protagonist with the terrifying realization that this house breathes at night in a language not meant for human understanding. The footsteps in the attic begin as a faint disturbance, the kind of soft thudding that could easily be dismissed as the wood settling or a small animal scurrying across old beams. But there is something intentional about the rhythm, something that feels too measured to be natural. The first time the protagonist hears it, they are lying awake in the dim glow of the moon filtering through thin curtains, trying to quiet their mind after witnessing the family's strange ritual. The sound interrupts the silence with a slow, deliberate cadence, one step, a pause, another step, another pause, as though whoever or whatever is moving up there is listening just as carefully as it is walking. The protagonist sits up, straining to hear more, and the house seems to hold its breath along with them. In the morning, they casually mention the noise to a family member, expecting a simple explanation. Instead, the reaction is immediate and troubling. The family member freezes, eyes widening just enough to betray fear before they quickly look away. They produce a short, sharp hum, one that cuts through the air like a warning, and walk away without attempting to explain. Later, when the protagonist tries again with another member of the household, the response is the same: rigid posture, flickering eyes, a tightening of the lips, and then silence. No one ever acknowledges that the attic exists, let alone that someone or something might be moving inside it. This avoidance only heightens the protagonist's unease, especially as the footsteps grow more pronounced. Sometimes the pattern changes, shifting from slow pacing to rapid, skittering movements that seem to dart from one end of the attic to the other. Other times, the steps stop directly above the protagonist's room, lingering there with an oppressive stillness that feels more threatening than the noise itself. On one particularly tense night, the footsteps are accompanied by what sounds like a faint dragging, a soft scrape like fabric or skin brushing across rough wood. It sends a cold shiver down the protagonist's spine, and yet the rest of the family moves through the house as though nothing unusual is happening, carefully avoiding any upward glances. What troubles the protagonist most is the realization that the family's silence about the attic is not rooted in ignorance but in fear. Their eyes flick upward instinctively whenever a floorboard creaks overhead, but they never touch the ladder or even step near the ceiling hatch. The protagonist begins to sense that the attic is not just a part of the house they avoid, it is a boundary, one that has been respected for generations because crossing it might draw the attention of something they have worked desperately to keep contained. Each night, as the footsteps resume their haunting rhythm, the protagonist feels the house tighten around them, as though whatever resides above is becoming increasingly aware of their presence and patience is running thin. The forbidden recordings come to the protagonist in a way that feels almost orchestrated, as though the house itself has decided the time has come for certain secrets to surface. It happens on a morning when the family is unusually quiet, even for them, moving through the hallways with a rigid tension that makes the air feel heavier. The protagonist notices a narrow cabinet tucked behind a dusty curtain in the back room, a piece of furniture so unremarkable it almost seems designed to be overlooked. Yet something about its placement feels intentional, as if it guards something no one once discovered. The cabinet is locked, but the lock is old and brittle, and with the faintest pressure it snaps, revealing a small collection of metal tins arranged with careful precision. Each tin is labeled only with a date, some going back nearly a century, and none of them marked with names. At first, the protagonist assumes these tins contain photographs or letters, remnants of normal family history. But when they pry open the first one, they find a tiny magnetic tape reel, the kind used long before digital equipment existed. Dust clings to the edges, but the reel itself is intact. Curiosity strong enough to override caution, the protagonist finds an old tape player stored nearby, wires tangled like veins waiting to be awakened. The moment the device clicks on, the room seems to narrow, the air tightening around the protagonist's chest in anticipation. The sounds that emerge from the speaker are not what anyone would expect from a family archive. There are no voices, no conversations, no laughter. Instead, the tape is filled with sharp breaths, low pulses, and an eerie layering of tones that resemble the strange language the family uses, but these sounds are rougher, more frantic, as though recorded during a time of fear or urgency. Some portions of the tape crackle with distortion, but the underlying pattern is unmistakable. The sounds mimic human speech without ever becoming real words. At moments, The tones spike in pitch, merging into something that almost resembles a scream but never fully becomes one, as if the person producing it was incapable of forming human phonetics. As the protagonist continues listening, they realize that each reel represents a different generation, each one capturing the gradual decline of spoken language within the family. Earlier recordings contain faint attempts at actual words, broken syllables struggling to emerge before dissolving into the familiar hums. But the later reels are entirely devoid of speech, filled instead with sounds that feel less human with every passing second. What chills the protagonist most is the gradual change in tone and timbre across the decades. The voices grow deeper, more resonant, and increasingly layered, as if an additional presence is joining the recordings, one not bound by human limits. When the protagonist finally shuts the player off, the silence that follows feels unnatural, as if the remnants of those inhuman tones still linger in the corners of the room. It becomes clear why the family hides these recordings. They are not memories, but warnings, evidence of something that has been evolving within their lineage, shaping their voices into something unrecognizable. And now that the protagonist has heard it, the house feels subtly different, as though those trapped sounds have awakened and are listening for a new voice to claim. The elder's warning comes at a moment when the protagonist least expects it, at a time when exhaustion and unease have begun to blur the edges of their perception. Days of witnessing strange rituals, hearing footsteps above hollow ceilings, and listening to the distorted recordings have worn down their sense of what is normal. The family moves around them with growing tension, their hums sharper, their eyes darting toward unseen corners. It feels as though something in the house is tightening, gathering itself, preparing for a shift none of them want to acknowledge. The protagonist is in the hallway when the eldest member of the family, a frail figure who rarely leaves their room, suddenly appears, shuffling forward with a determination that looks painful to maintain. The elder's presence alone is unsettling. Their face is pale, almost translucent in the dim light, and their eyes carry a depth of fear that no one else in the family openly displays. They approach slowly, each step echoing faintly in the silence, and the other family members freeze where they stand. Their hums falter, thinning into barely audible vibrations as they watch the elder pass, like witnesses to an act strictly forbidden. The protagonist senses that whatever is about to happen is something the family has long tried to prevent. When the elder reaches them, they lift a trembling hand and grip the protagonist's wrist with surprising strength. Their breath is shallow, their chest rattling like an old furnace struggling for air. For a moment, the protagonist expects another patterned hum, another cryptic resonance. But instead, the elder forces a single whispered word past their lips, one that sounds jagged and unused, as though their vocal cords are fighting a memory they buried long ago. "Don't listen too long," they rasp, the words scraping out like something dragged across gravel. It listens back. The sound of actual speech is jarring, unnatural in the context of the household. It seems to ripple through the air, and the walls themselves feel as if they tense, absorbing the vibration greedily. The family reacts instantly. Several gasp in their strange, breathy way, and a low, urgent hum sweeps through the group like a warning siren. The elder's body shudders violently, knees buckling as if speaking aloud has triggered some internal collapse. They fall against the protagonist, eyes wide with terror, and for a fleeting second it seems like they are trying to say more, but their mouth opens soundlessly, frozen in a silent scream. The family rushes forward, pulling the elder away with desperate, synchronized movements, their hums rising into a frantic chorus that seems almost like a plea. The protagonist is left standing alone in the corridor, heart pounding, realizing that the elder's warning was not poetic or symbolic, it was literal. Something in the house is listening. Something has always been listening. And now, because the protagonist has heard actual words spoken in its presence, it may have turned its attention fully toward them. The morning after the elder's collapse, the house feels different in a way that is impossible to articulate. The protagonist wakes with the sense that the silence itself has changed texture, becoming thicker, almost tactile, as though it presses lightly against their ears from the inside. When they step into the hallway, the family is already awake, gathered in small clusters, their faces drawn tight with anxiety. Their usual soft hums, once gentle and patterned, now carry an edge sharper, quicker, more erratic. The sounds no longer feel like a language but like a warning, their tones fractured as though something has disrupted the rhythm they've maintained for generations. The protagonist watches as the family communicates through these disjointed pulses, noting the fear in their eyes each time the house creaks or shifts, as if every noise might be the start of something they have long tried to prevent. The shift becomes undeniable during breakfast, when one of the younger family members emits a sound unlike anything the protagonist has heard before. It begins as the usual low hum but then elongates unnaturally, stretching into a high, warbling note that vibrates in the air like a tuning fork struck too hard. Everyone freezes. The sound cuts off abruptly, leaving the room in a suffocating silence. Then, almost immediately, others begin to echo similar tones, short bursts of clicking noises, guttural pulses, irregular vibrations that no human vocal cords should be able to produce. It's as though the language is mutating, evolving on its own, shifting into forms that resemble no earthly pattern. The protagonist tries to speak, tries to ask what is happening, but the moment a word forms on their tongue, the family flinches as if struck. The mother of the house presses her fingers to her throat and releases a new sound, deep, resonant, almost subsonic. The floorboards tremble beneath it. The protagonist steps back instinctively, a cold flush creeping down their spine. The family isn't merely afraid, they are struggling to keep control of something inside them, something that is changing the very nature of the sounds they make. It is clear that the elders' whispered words have disrupted a delicate balance, and now the language they rely on is unraveling, slipping into forms that feel less learned and more summoned. As the day unfolds, the protagonist notices the changes intensifying. Children emit rapid clicking sequences that echo through the halls. Adults produce layered tones that seem to overlap, as though multiple voices are speaking from a single throat. At times, the sounds reverberate so strongly that picture frames rattle on the walls. What terrifies the protagonist most is not the strangeness of the noise itself but the look in the family's eyes when they make them. They appear horrified, confused, and above all helpless, because the sounds are no longer something they are choosing to produce. It feels as though the language is no longer theirs to control, as if something ancient has begun speaking through them, twisting their silence into a shape it has been waiting centuries to take. The first time the protagonist realizes the language is affecting them personally, it begins subtly, almost imperceptibly, as a faint echo in the back of their mind. At first, they dismiss it as fatigue or the lingering unease from nights spent listening to the family's pulsing hums and warped tones. But soon, the sounds start to linger after the family has stopped, embedding themselves into the protagonist's thoughts. When they try to speak aloud, words feel heavy, clumsy, as if their tongue and throat no longer recognize the mechanics of human speech. Instead, soft vibrations rise in the back of their throat, involuntary and unbidden, mimicking the layered hums of the family. Panic strikes first, a flush of heat and dread, because the sounds feel alive, as though they are not being produced by the protagonist, but through them. By the next day, the mimicry intensifies. The protagonist wakes to find low hums, clicks, and fragmented tones spilling from their own lips even before consciousness fully settles. Attempts to stop the sounds are futile. The language seems to have taken residence in their vocal cords, rehearsing itself in patterns that are alien yet familiar, echoing the rituals and recordings they have observed. Each time they inhale, the air vibrates unnaturally, carrying the pulsing quality of the family's long-hidden dialect. It is no longer mere observation, they have become a conduit. Fear creeps in not just for themselves, but for the unseen force that might now recognize a new host, one unprepared for what it has inherited. The physical toll is immediate. Throbbing pain settles in the temples, as if the protagonist's brain is being rewired to accommodate the strange, layered frequencies that pass through them. Sleep is fractured, dreams are filled with disjointed voices that speak in harmonics instead of words, rising and falling like tidal waves of sound. Waking feels no relief. Any quiet moment is invaded by faint whispers, almost too soft to hear, yet impossible to ignore. The protagonist begins noticing involuntary gestures accompanying the sounds, slight head tilts, fluttering lips, hands moving in subtle rhythms they don't consciously control. Their body seems compelled to participate in the language even when their mind resists. Social interactions outside the house become impossible. Any attempt to speak normal words feels alien, awkward, stunted. The protagonist can no longer maintain the distinction between human speech and this invasive, evolving language. It is as though the family's centuries-long silence has passed a burden directly into them, transforming their own voice into something partially theirs and partially the house's. The realization that the sounds are not just mimicry but a kind of possession fills them with mounting dread, because they can feel the language learning, adapting, integrating itself into their being, waiting for the moment when resistance will be futile and they will no longer speak at all in human terms. The attic door opens on its own one night, a sound that cuts through the oppressive quiet of the house like a knife through fabric. The protagonist is already on edge from days of strange noises and the invasive effects of the family's evolving language, and the sudden creak of the aged hinges triggers an immediate, visceral fear. The door swings slowly, almost deliberately, revealing the dim, shadowed space beyond. A thin sliver of moonlight pierces the gloom, illuminating dust motes that hang like tiny specters in the air. The attic seems impossibly deep, stretching farther than its architecture should allow, the rafters disappearing into darkness as though the room itself is breathing, expanding to accommodate something unseen. The air that escapes carries a chill, laden with the faint scent of mildew and something far older, a metallic tang that makes the protagonist's stomach turn. Compelled by both dread and curiosity, the protagonist steps closer, their hand hovering over the doorknob as the floorboards groan beneath each cautious step. From inside the attic comes a soft scratching, irregular but deliberate, like nails dragged across rough wood. The sound is accompanied by small, jagged marks etched into the floorboards, symbols that seem ancient, arranged in patterns that defy comprehension. They spiral and intersect in ways that make the protagonist's stomach knot, as though the markings themselves are alive, waiting for recognition. It is clear immediately that someone or something tried to escape, leaving evidence of struggle frozen in time, yet the attic has remained sealed for decades, untouched by human hands. The thought that whatever made these marks is still present sends a shiver down the protagonist's spine. The deeper the protagonist ventures, the more unsettling the details become. Ripped fragments of fabric and dried remnants of what might have once been bedding lie scattered across the floor, but nothing resembles a typical habitation. The attic is a shrine to absence, a place that holds the memory of someone or something pushed beyond human endurance. Shadows pool in corners where light cannot reach, and faint echoes of the family's rhythmic hums from below reverberate through the beams, twisting into distorted forms as they travel upward. It feels as though the space itself is aware of the protagonist, each creak and sigh timed with an intelligence that is not human. The final, horrifying realization strikes when the protagonist notices the pattern of scratches leading to a far corner, ending abruptly. There is no escape point, no exit for the entity that once struggled there, only a wall that seems unnaturally solid. And yet, despite the lack of a logical path, the scratches suggest desperation, a last attempt to flee something far more ancient and patient than any human. The attic is no longer merely a hidden space above the house, it is a boundary, a barrier separating what the family has contained for generations from a presence that waits, silent and hungry, for the next voice foolish enough to call it forth. The truth behind the family's secret, the reason their language had evolved into something no human could recognize, slowly reveals itself in moments of terrifying clarity. The protagonist begins to see patterns in the rituals, the hums, and the attic's hidden markings that suggest the language was never simply a human invention. It was never just a defensive measure or a familial quirk. Each generation had inherited not only silence but a conduit to something far older, a presence that had whispered, taught, and shaped the very tones that now vibrated through their throats. The realization comes in stages, creeping in as the protagonist pieces together the family's fragmented history, the recordings, and the warnings of the elder who had collapsed. The language is not theirs in any true sense, it is something they were chosen to carry, a vessel through which an ancient consciousness continues to speak and adapt. The house itself seems complicit in the revelation, the walls and floors pulsing with subtle vibrations that resonate with the evolving tones of the family's voices. It becomes impossible to distinguish where the family ends and the language begins, as if the inhuman patterns have been teaching themselves through each generation. The recordings, the rituals, the strange nocturnal harmonies, they are all evidence that the language has always been more than communication. It is a form of life, a presence that can inhabit and influence the living. The protagonist feels the weight of this slowly pressing down, realizing that hearing or producing the sounds is no longer a passive act. To engage with the language is to invite it into one's own mind, to risk becoming part of its eternal pattern. The more the protagonist interacts with the family, the clearer it becomes that the entity waits for a host who is susceptible enough to carry it fully. The subtle mimicking, the involuntary vibrations that have begun to emerge in their own voice, are signs that the language is not content to remain confined to its current human vessels. It seeks expansion, and each human who becomes fluent in its strange rhythms provides a new channel through which it can exist. The protagonist realizes that every attempt to speak, every curiosity about the family's silence, has been a step closer to becoming entwined with the entity. The hums and clicks, the attic scratches, the forbidden recordings all are markers of a lineage conditioned to survive under a force that cannot be reasoned with, only obeyed or ignored at peril. The ultimate horror lies in the understanding that the language is not just a family tradition, it is a legacy of something alive, something patient and relentless. Generations of silence were never merely precaution, they were training, containment, a delicate balance between human life and a force older than memory. The protagonist recognizes the peril they now face. They have become part of a continuum that cannot be escaped, a living participant in a language that listens, learns, and waits for the next human voice willing or unwilling to surrender to its incomprehensible demands. The house, the family, and the language are inseparable, and to witness it fully is to confront a truth that no human tongue can articulate, a presence that has endured across centuries, ready to continue its influence through anyone who dares to hear.